Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, the film that the Kremlin and its useful idiots across the EU do not want you to see, so go out and see it. We're going to be talking about some of those useful idiots today, because on the show, helping me stare into the dark abyss are Olga Lautman and Monique Camarra, two brilliant analysts of the Kremlin File podcast. And we're going to be looking at the larger manipulation of the dynamics at play today in the world, how Russia is driving and working with bad actors in the terrorist realm. And of course, I'm going to include Hamas, Iran, the Russian-linked, Russian-backed politicians, and astroturfing protest groups in Europe and elsewhere, and how this mind manipulation threatens to divide Americans even more than we're divided now, leading into probably the worst year of our lives, 2024, the election that is going to determine the fate of the world. So that's a lot that we're going to cover, but this is the stuff that we talk about anyway, and I had to stop our conversation so we could finally hit record because Olga and Monique were cooking and I wanted everyone to hear it too. So ladies, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea.
And Monique is joining us from Italy, where she is covering the Italian press. And I want to start with Russia. So what is Russia's role, do you think? The timing of Hamas's super sophisticated terror attack, where people had cognitive dissonance, where they heard that Hamas used paragliders, because this was sweeping, well-funded, well-organized, and the timing could not have been better for Russia. They're losing the war. Their economy is shrinking. Putin faced his first meaningful threat to his power, a military coup, and so on the list goes. And the sanctions are biting. And Trump's being arrested left and right. And he needs Trump to win the White House in order to get the Russian White House back. So the timing of this is really suspicious. Hamas was in Moscow this past week. They're there earlier this year. What are your thoughts on Russia's role in Hamas's terrorist attack and how Russia benefits? Do you see the hand of Russia in this? And if so, why?
Oh, big time. But Olga, why don't you roll and then I'll add.
Where do I begin? The night I happened to be up as I saw the paragliders coming in and watched the attack unfold on October 7th. And I mean, I've, monitored Hamas. It's not my expertise, but I just monitor anything that Russia is involved with. And these are not their tactics. Russia is the one who has, the expertise to breach borders and to carry out invasions. Even Iran doesn't have this. So historically, just to give a little background, Russia for decades, back to the Soviet Union, has been very close with Hamas. I mean, they have, they have meetings. I mean, they were there last week, but they've, come visit Russia at least once or twice a year over the years. At the same time, another key factor is Hezbollah, because Russia worked very closely with Hezbollah, which is another terrorist organization. And they worked so closely together that they set up an operations center in Syria, in Latakia, to carry out the mass murders of Syrians, which, by some accounts can amount to close to 1 million Syrians that Assad and Russia and Iran have murdered since, the past 13 years. Russia has also been selling weapons to both organizations. Syria has been a transit point for the past year and a half, which is actually, very, very frustrating, of Iranian weapons and components making their way to Russia that are being used to kill Ukrainians. And this, when I watched this attack unfold, my first question literally, and I think as I saw the paragliders coming, the first thing I put on Twitter was, where is Russia's role in this? Because I am sorry. This was a very coordinated attack. Very, very coordinated. This was very well planned. You saw Iranian fingerprints. Despite what Israel and U.S. is saying, you saw the Iranian fingerprints in it. But Iranians have limitations into what their expertise are. And for instance, even just paragliding into another country, where did Hamas learn to use these paragliders? Where did they train for this? Because if there were people paragliding over the past 2 years in Gaza, then obviously we would have heard some kind of reports of, oh, look, people are in the air. But there was nothing. So these people had to be trained offshore. And if I was U.S. agencies and European agencies and Israeli agencies, I would check to see the travel of who traveled to Russia over the past few years to receive the training. And Russia is known to train terrorist organizations. Al-Zawahiri, the number 2 of Al-Qaeda, went in 97, I believe, was trained 6 months inside of Russia in an FSB camp. So Russia has a very, very long history of not only providing weapons to terrorists, but also providing the training and everything else, the logistical support, and then obviously with it, the information warfare operations that they help conduct, as we're seeing that you can't step on any platform right now with just seeing a bunch of bullshit mixed in with actual facts. So I definitely would think Russia has a role in this. And as with Russia's, again, going back to the Soviet Union, both the Soviets and actually you could go back to the Tsars. The anti-Semitism operations over the past centuries have been rampant. This is the whole exact point of why half of Ukrainian Jews are here and Russian Jews are in U.S. Because in the 70s, the pressure inside the Soviet Union was so great for the Jewish population that the KGB, which Kalugin, who at the time was heading counterintelligence, had told me that he went to Andropov and said, yes, we should sign on to the Jackson-Vanik amendments and let the Jews out so we can ease the pressure here inside of the Soviet Union, and at the same time we can send out Trojan horses and potential KGB operatives who, after they assimilate in Israel and in U.S., that we can tap them in a few years and to remind them of the motherland and where their loyalty should lie. And they've conducted these operations for decades, and as with everything Russia does, they have run this well-coordinated global disinformation and hate operation so well that now it bounced back into Russia, as with everything they do. They did this with COVID. They spread so much COVID disinformation and ran such a organized campaign against COVID with, all the conspiracies and microchips and whatever. But Russia's not immune to it because they're not shut off from the internet. It came back to them and they ended up having, a whole population who did not want to take the vaccine because they thought that there were microchips and some other garbage inside the vaccine. Same thing is happening now. Now you have the whole Muslim community in Russia. It started with Dagestan, who attacked an airport. And now they're putting out calls for the whole Muslim community across Russia to unite. And you have to remember, there is close to 25 million, if not 30 million Muslims inside of Russia. And now, from their global operations, they blew right back to inside of Russia. And it'll be interesting to see how Putin handles it, because he cannot tamp down these operations, because then he's going to have Kadyrov and the Chechens and the Dagestanis and the Ingushetians and everyone who will even bring more challenge to his power and more unrest inside.
You referenced that story of a flight from Tel Aviv landing in Russia and being stormed by a mob, essentially.
They were hunting for Jews for 2 days. They were hunting to kill Jews. And the thing is that people think this is some kind of well-coordinated FSB operation. No, it's not. Dagestan, Russia couldn't care less about Dagestan. This is the blowback from the operations they're fueling globally. And I mean, this is not the beginning. These are the same people who are coming out who, have argued over the years how.
Yeah, and it's important to point out that Russia is essentially a house of cards. It's made up of all of these different ethnic republics that the Russian forces are squeezing for bodies to feed into its meat grinder. It's not the hipster Russians in St. Petersburg and Moscow who are being sent to war. It's the ethnic republics like Dagestan and elsewhere.
Well, yeah, and that's even last year I had said that Russia's conducting ethnic cleansing because the huge proportion, when you look of how many of these republics were being sent into the meat grinder versus the ethnic Russians. I mean, the figures are staggering when you compare the ethnic Russians to the minorities that are being sent to basically execution.
It's ethnic cleansing that could absolutely backfire because what they're getting like real world combat military training that they could then use against the regime to break away.
Well, as a policy, just to add, okay, a little something, just in case anybody wants to read up on these kind of things. What Olga was talking about before from the 1950s, there's a lot of people that have written about it being an actual military, economic, and political strategy that Russia had used and instituted in the 1950s. If anybody is at all interested in reading about it, there's Joseph D. Douglas, who wrote Great Peace on why the Soviets violate arms control treaties, and it gives you a very detailed description of how they see treaties and what it really means. And this is really important if we're going to touch on, let's say, the protest movements and what we're seeing, all the BS that we're seeing online and on the streets, what they mean by peace and what they mean by disarmament. Because this is a big, big topic, especially when it's tied to Ukraine as well, because we've seen protest movements about, disarmament and let's call for peace treaties. But what does it mean in, let's say, the Russian mentality, and what does it mean for us? And this is something that if anybody wants to take a look at, it's a great piece. So that's that part there. In Dagestan, from my knowledge, they've been having protests for all sorts of things in the past few months. Oil prices, at the gas prices that have gone up. So every once in a while they torch something. So it's a really destabilized area, which, this is something that the Russians fear. And this is also a topic of what it means globally, these kind of small, localized proxy wars in different areas, which is what I think is going to happen, let's say, eventually. Eventually, we're starting to see it. So I think that's one of the effects of, what we're seeing and what it will do to the war in Ukraine, which is what I'm really worried about, especially. I don't know whether, you guys have anything to add about that or not.
So you think so the way I see it, I want to follow up with Monique, is I see it as Russia with its close alignment and very practical collaboration with both Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah controlling southern Lebanon, which has been firing rockets into Israel and threatening opening up another front. Russia completely owns Syria. Syria is now a Russian military base, the first ever it's been able to capture on the Mediterranean. And Russia uses Syria as a staging ground for all of its imperialist operations across the continent of Africa, including sending their proxies over to Sudan, where they full on fermented a military coup. Yeah, so and
Niger.
Niger and so on. And the whole Africa operation. And I want to talk to the idiots on the far left, my family, my ideological family, because we agree on domestic issues by and large. But when back in the day, like when so many on the left harassed Syrian human rights activists and turned their back on Syria and amplified Russian disinformation, blaming the victim in Syria and full on it was a horrible capitulation, moral capitulation. And Obama, representing this big muddled, the death of truth when it came to Syria, refusing to support the red line that he drew in Syria, which just invites weakness that invites further tests by Russia. And all that did was allow Russia to capture Syria, when we should have had a strong U.S. presence there back in the day. And if we had, maybe Ukraine wouldn't have happened. And if we had, maybe Russia wouldn't have been able to push even further militarily across Africa, slaughtering innocent civilians caught in the crossfires of its imperialist ambitions. So there you go. That's why we talk about these things. And that's why we have to focus on this.
I could add on the Syria angle because I work on Syrian issues and I work with Syrian human rights organizations. And after the Arab Spring peaceful protest by, I would say, 2012 at the earliest, Russia started sending, when Assad's power was being challenged, by peaceful protest. These were teenagers who were being slaughtered. Russia gave the green light to Kadyrov to send Chechens there. So eventually in 2015, Russians did enter officially, but from 2012, there were Chechens, there were Russian military advisors assisting, working alongside Iran, all the Iranian proxy groups, and Assad, and frankly ISIS, to make sure and quell these protests. And this resulted in close to 1 million Syrians being slaughtered. Chemical weapons used against kids and women and elderly. I know people who ran underground hospitals to treat these chemical victim patients. And at the same time, as this was happening, Russia had illegally annexed Crimea. Same thing, little green men. I'm shocked they come in on paragliders. I guess they, Russia perfected their tactics after. But same exact thing. They annexed Crimea. They occupied illegally Donbass. And then you saw the same exact Russian military personnel shuffling from Crimea and from Ukraine, because at the time they also tried to take Kharkiv and Odessa and Mariupol and Melitopol and others. You saw the same people shuffling back and forth from there to Syria and back and forth. And I mean, the Ukrainians have a huge, huge database of every single person who has operated in Chechnya, their soil, and Syria. And at the same time, when this was happening, Russia carried out a very, very, very organized disinformation operation, a campaign, and frankly, information warfare across the whole globe, trying to convince that Crimea and Donbass was legitimately Russian, which is not. It's Ukrainian territory, always has been. And at the same time, running disinformation operations for Assad, to cover for his mass murders, to cover for the use of chemical weapons, and to cover for the slaughter of innocent Syrians who were being pushed off their land and had to give up everything to move and get squeezed further and further and further. And now these are the same organizations that you see. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say every single protester. The majority of protesters have extremely good intentions. They are seeing horrific images come out and they are standing up for them. And that is fine. I'm talking about the drivers behind it. And these are the same people who whitewashed Assad's chemical weapons, who whitewashed the execution of Crimeans, the execution of Tatars. If they're so concerned about Muslims, what happened with the Tatars that were being executed in Crimea, who were being put into concentration camps? And that's it. And this you're just seeing. And these same people were being repurposed because Russia, back to Soviet days, historically has always aligned with the extreme left. I'm not even going to call it the far left. It's the extreme fringe left.
It's straight up horseshoe theory. It's what that French philosopher came up with. The extremes are so extremes that they meet in the middle.
Yeah, this is something that goes back to the Second World War.
Yeah, and Russia used these same groups to lie about annexation of Crimea, to lie about MH17, to freaking glorify Stalin and Lenin, who murdered, I mean, they talk about mass murderers, these are mass murderers, and to lie about Syria, lie about Syrian chemical weapons being used and say that this never did happen, when obviously there is more than ample enough evidence that Syrians were subjected to chemical attacks by Assad with the help of Russia's forces. And frankly, then you saw them being repurposed in various, things with U.S. elections in 2016, and then on and on and on. Again, not all the protesters. The protesters, legitimately are seeing scenes, and they're coming out and voicing their support for Palestine. And I mean, it's the same thing when we saw, what was happening inside of Mariupol, carpet bombing of cities. But the puppet drivers behind this is the people that need to be looked into.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And on that, exactly. I mean, we know in London, for example, it was Stop the War that organized the big protest. I listen every single day to radio just to hear what people are actually saying. Normal people, the call-in shows and stuff like that. I have it on the background as I'm working away. And they keep repeating, like Olga said, these are the same narratives that have been carried forward from years and years, all the way back to like the early 60s, late 50s, anti-American, the disarmament arguments that they used at that time, okay, for anti-nuclear. So it's the exact same. There's no difference whatsoever. You could draw a line all the way through it. And the drivers, as Olga was saying, I mentioned Stop the War, which we saw against Ukraine in Washington, supporting Assange and supporting others who are actively, okay, and that we know are affiliated with Russia. So this is what we're talking about. So now they've transposed themselves in London. They've taken up, the mantle of doing this kind of thing. I can tell you that here in Italy, they're using the student unions. They've gone a micro level. This was a group of people that had formed, I would say, probably the first years. I caught them before that, but the first years of Trump's White House, his presidency, 2017, I would say, 2017. I was looking at all the stuff for QAnon at that time when it started to appear. And I noticed these crazy Italians, okay, talking. And I said, who the hell is this? They had YouTube channels set up. They went from very few followers all the way to explosions as we see today, where they take, a certain personality, a kid who's in, I don't know, Texas or whatever, playing on his keyboard, and all of a sudden, he's got 500,000.
Send them a Russian escort.
Okay. Who the fuck is he? Oh, sorry. Can I say that? So all of this kind of thing, the Italian, this guy that nobody, okay, who is he exactly? But anyway, the point is that these people started, as Olga was saying, right from, okay, early on, and they're just being recycled, and they move, right? It's the same narrative, but they move from one crisis point to the other. And I wouldn't say coordinated. It's sort of like they've learned what they have to do. And they probably don't even have to be told. Or they're given instructions. I have no idea at this point, not yet. But this is the way, okay, what we're seeing.
No, they're indoctrinated.
Exactly. Well, the ones that are on the absolute left, like we're talking, I wouldn't even consider them, they're not even mainstream. I mean, these people are really dangerous, okay? And they have let's say, fame and access to media that they're punching way over, okay, their actual weight. In terms of representation, I can tell you that in the last elections, this whole group got something under 4%, okay, of the vote, which means they're not even represented in parliament. But they were splashed all over the news talking anti-American, anti-NATO, which is really dangerous, and reusing all of those narratives that we've seen for years and years and years. And they're repurposing them and they just use it. Okay, now it's Hamas. Okay, here you go. All right. And it's the same thing. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. What's really dangerous in my view as well, is that now Russia has more partners. So we've seen, for example, all sorts of meetings with, okay, let's put Orban aside for now, but we've seen them with Vietnam, North Korea. I don't know how much they're getting from these countries. China, okay, constantly. This is already maybe the third time that Lavrov, he's traveling all over the place. So this is what I find dangerous, because they are now expanding, whereas before they were a little more isolated and they didn't have, or at least we didn't know, it wasn't public. But now we see them overtly, okay, with lots and lots of connections. And this is why, I had said before, we have to be careful, because this means an extension of smaller wars that pop up here and there, okay, little proxy wars and stuff like that.
Russia has been setting off global hotspots. Look what's happening in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And, and frankly, everywhere you look, there is chaos, unfolding. And again, this would be a complete different, podcast episode to have a discussion, on the actual issues between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Israel and Palestine. That you can sit and have a whole podcast series for a year to discuss, all the things that were done incorrectly in these regions. But this is more of, Russia, if not being directly involved, which I frankly think, someone really should investigate, at least coordinating with Iran, with China, with North Korea, and frankly, every autocratic regime that wants to see the destruction of the West and wants to see the destruction of human rights, equality, and whatnot. And that's where it's dangerous.
Yeah, Russia's brand is chaos. It is a terrorist state that is backing terrorist regimes around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And why are they doing this? To enrich themselves, to stay in power and enrich themselves. It's a smash and grab for wealth and power. And it's just so they could have a whole fleet of super yachts and die in power. That's why they're doing it. They're modern day pirates in a sense, but way worse. And, they torture and carry out just sadistic acts of inhumanity, just like Stalin did. And it's the OGPU, it's the NKVD, it's the KGB, it's whatever you want to call it. It's a terror police regime. And the anti-imperialist left that falls for it every time.
Every single time.
Like Lucy's football, they just are there. I want to turn to you, Monique, about the reporting that you were mentioning before we hit record out of Italy on the Russian SVR agents that were in Gaza in the lead up to Hamas's big terror attack. Could you speak on that?
No. No, it's very brief. They had visited, they had hooked, they had linked these visits, okay, this visit with what we know about Hamas and Iran, which had already visited, okay, this year, once in October and once in March, right, that we know officially. So this is what? There's 7 SVR agents, basically.
And just a reminder that Wagner, operated in Syria and since 2014, since its formation, which, by the way, was formed by a GRU colonel who had Nazi paraphernalia stamped on his neck and is a Nazi worshiper. But before that, he came from Syria, from the, Slavonic Corps. So you have had Russians, besides Chechens and Russian advisors, you had mercenary groups operating in the region for at least the past decade. For God's sakes, Malofeyev, the king of the far right, who, runs operations across Europe and through evangelicals and other religious affiliates in the United States to sow division, had a freaking mercenary group in Syria. And has, there are so many of them that were there. And also the tactics used. Hamas, what we saw October 7th unfold, the beheadings, the setting people on fire, the rapes, the executions, the kidnappings, This is exactly what Russia's been doing since 2014 in Ukraine. I mean, the only thing Hamas missed out is taking children and then, erasing their Jewish heritage to reprogram them as Middle Eastern. That's the only thing that's missing, because Russia did that on a wholesale scale, taking Ukrainian children, erasing their Ukrainian heritage, making them forget their, Ukrainian anthem, to repurpose them, brainwash them to be Russians. So, I mean, the tactics are very, very, similar. And here you have people who overlook what Russia does because they're a country with a supposed leader. They overlook all of this, but then they're very quick to call out the Hamas terrorist attacks. And that's where I want to know, what is the difference between Hamas and the Russian military? Because frankly, I don't see this in Western militaries for all the wrong we have done. And God knows I have a lot of criticism, of U.S. policy and European policy, but we do not go town, house by house in towns, massacring people, raping women and children in front of their husbands, executing them, cutting their tongues out, setting them on fire. We don't do this. This is not part of our military policy. This is part of, however, the Soviet policy of the Soviet military. This is what they did in the Afghan wars, first and second, and this is part of the Russian military.
It definitely looks like Wagner terror tactics,
Yeah.
militarized terror tactics, industrialized terror. That's Russia.
Yeah. And what we keep forgetting too is that the Wagner, all of the irregular troops, the Russian irregular troops, are all through the coup belt. We're talking, they're all there, and they're still there. They're in 22 countries, or I think that's the last count, probably more. They're entrenching themselves in these areas, right, with these kind of tactics. And we should be looking at the larger picture. And I'm asking, and I have been asking, what are we going to do? We've got, the European Union, who is basically lagging behind. They still haven't got their act together. Still the 12th package they haven't been able to decide on. We've got Slovakia now.
And Slovakia's new government is pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian.
Slovakia now, Fico, okay, here you go, You've got Orban, who every once in a while just takes everybody and is using himself, okay? Tact is in Italians, we say ricatto, where they're trying to, he threatens in order to get something, okay, for himself. The last time I think it was to take off sanctions from OTP, the bank.
There's an Italian word for that?
Ricatto. Oh yeah, of course. There's always, remember, we're Machiavelli, the Romans, we're really good at this kind of stuff. That's
Is
why
ball
Italians,
busting an Italian word?
You know what? Italians and Russians, that's why they understand each other. This kind of stuff is like, got it. Okay, mafia tactics. Here we go. All right.
There's a lot of love there.
It's easy to understand. You know what I mean? So this is the kind of thing. They still haven't put those sanctions or any mechanism whatsoever on Russian diamonds that we've been going after them for like months. And since the beginning of the war, Alrosa is still operating without any problems, okay? And they've been able to sell their stuff all through the markets, and we're talking huge billions and billions, okay, of dollars. So, this is the EU, okay? NATO, I think, is starting to sort of wake up to the thing, but I don't know how much they're doing. They have to increase production of armaments in Europe, but also in the United States. We're falling behind on what we need to provide to Ukraine to get going, because we keep forgetting that all of this other stuff is distracting from the real threat of what is going on right now. And it's Ukrainians dying, and Ukrainians that have to fight, okay, in order to save, right, their nation. We keep forgetting this kind of stuff. All of a sudden, it becomes important, the protester who's talking about disarmament or whatever. It's like, oh, come on, okay, look at what is happening, okay, on the ground. That kind of situation. It's distracting from this kind of thing. In the US, everybody is shaking. I mean, who are they going to put in the White House? Okay, because this is going to be another factor, okay, that will come into play at some point. Well, when the elections roll around. I don't know what kind of reaction Europe will have. I'm hoping that they will continue, also because the war is right here in Europe, in the center of Europe, and this is the direct effects. But it's pretty scary stuff. having on the one hand where you have Russia that seems to be growing, because we don't really know, okay? Just like the Chinese who have the BRI, then you go and look to see what actually gets done. They have this big, huge scheme, and then, you look at the satellite photos, and they say, we've developed this port, it's fantastic, and then you look at the satellite, and it's like a little boat on a beach, okay? And that's it, all right? So, we have to sort of be careful, we weigh, how much. What are they getting? Is it Russia getting armaments that they need from these countries? Free flow of money, free flow of other, resources that they need? What is it exactly? And Olga knows all about this kind of thing.
And speaking of armaments and Netanyahu, first of all, Netanyahu was very cozy with Putin until Russia, the past few weeks showed him that, where their loyalties lie, or at least where their financial.
Israeli official who went on to Russian TV and just told them off for backing Hamas.
Mm-hmm. And then, second of all, Israel, with the knowledge of the Israeli government, has been providing Russia with technology and weapons to kill Ukrainians. I mean, hopefully now this will stop. But this has been going on. Because obviously Chinese technology is not cutting it. And the technology in the Lancet and the Orlan drones and technology is coming. I mean, besides the fact that it's coming from United States across Europe via third-party countries, Israel has played a huge role in looking the other way as these things make their way into weapons that are massacring Ukrainians. So, this actually, with Russia, I'm a drop more hopeful, because Russia, carries out their operations, and they always use the same playbook. I swear to God, every time I see something, it's like literally you can envision the same thing happening. I can even write what their next operations will be because of how, they really rarely change tactics. I am a drop more hopeful because, as with all Russian intelligence operations, they not only are getting blowback inside of Russia, which is going to be very interesting to see what happens over the next several months and how it weakens, Russia domestically, but they're also getting this divide from the Republicans who normally have stood loyal to Russia, are now, even though granted they're still spewing anti-Ukraine nonsense and against providing aid, which I think is going to happen. But Russia seemed to lose this crowd because now they have shifted right over, and now they are, it's going to be very hard for them to reconcile being loyal to Russia and at the same time pushing for Israeli aid. And luckily on the Senate side, the Republican senators are very, very adamant that they want Israeli aid and Ukrainian aid tied together. So, we'll see how it plays out. As of now, I'm not as much worried, and that's it. So with Russia, they always carry out these operations, but they never fully think them through because there's no one exact response. And same thing here. I worry about the U.S. elections and whatnot, but again, we're absorbing this, from social media. And we're seeing this heated stuff right now. We'll see what happens in a year from now. It'll be more clear as we approach even next spring of where U.S. politics stay. But I can tell you that Russia's number one policy, not Putin, and that's where people need to stop solely putting everything on Putin, because this is the Russian system and the Russian agencies, I call it the Cheka system. Their number one goal will be to disrupt every single European and U.S. elections and cause as much chaos to stretch United States and their allies thin. And that's it. But even with that, it might backfire, because I really want to see now with U.S. moving half of their resources into the Middle East, again, how is Russia going to be able to move weapons back and forth? What about Syrian Iranians proxies who are hitting U.S. forces? we are hitting right back, and we're going to see a lot more of it. And these are all the same facilities that are producing or storing weapons are making their way to Ukraine also. So we'll see how it goes. With this, I mean, it might end up biting Russia in the ass as well.
And you know what, too? Even what you guys had mentioned, right, Netanyahu and all of that. Maybe he can also serve as a cautionary tale to, different leaders who think that they can do business with Russia. Look at what happens when you cozy up to these kind of people. What do they think? That they're actually going to get something from Russia and that they're going to have, let's say, a relationship at par? Do the Slovakians, does Fico really think this? Is it just because that way he can make money and that's it? And again, he'll weaken his state from within. This is what happened in Italy. This is exactly what happened in Italy for years and years and years. I mean, we're cautionary tales. People should be looking how screwed up, our countries are. I'm talking about my country here, and I'm talking about what's going on in Hungary, and I'm talking about what's going on and will go on in Slovakia. All right, that was my point. It wasn't so much. We all know that Netanyahu was the worst thing that could have happened to Israel.
It's the same like Trump. Trump would absolutely coordinate with Russia to freaking even kill several thousand Americans if it served the purpose for him to gain power or strengthen his power or whatever. So, and Netanyahu comes from the same...
he practically did. He let all those Taliban fighters go in Afghanistan, like 5,000. 5,000. And on top of that, he let his Russian friends put a bounty on the heads of U.S. military in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
exactly.
So one thing someone in U.S. intelligence said to me once was that the visa you mentioned, that visa policy back in the 70s, Olga, where Russian, good old-fashioned Moscow anti-Semitism said, let's get rid of the Jews. Let's get them out of our country finally. And let's sneak in some Trojan horses. And it's very similar to the operation, for instance, using religion to entrench Russian genocidal imperialist power. A parallel would be how the Russian Orthodox Church was allowed to operate during the Soviet Union because it was the KGB church. They would send these priests that were actually KGB agents all over the world on these goodwill missions. Like the Western officials would cozy up to them, and that was how they got their foot in. That they collected intel that way, and that's also how they spied on the people and kept tabs on the Russian people domestically. And so a parallel to that is the Jackson-Varick policy, where if you're Jewish, you can go abroad, you can go to Israel, you can go to the U.S. And by the way, we're sending our KGB agents in this big group of people who are fleeing abroad. And one person in intelligence told me that because of that, Israel, in his own words, he said, Israel got fucked. Mm-hmm. He's like, Israel's so deeply fucked.
And America.
Well, think about that whole policy rose with with Fred Trump.
I know the policy. I came through that policy.
You came through the policy. So the policy was a great thing because it gave us you. And then it also gave us...
And Vindman. The Vindman brothers came through the policy.
There we go.
So we're not trying to paint a broad brush. We're not trying to say if you came with this policy, that makes you... Because that's racism, right? No, but the reality is that the Russians, their good old-fashioned way of doing things, took full advantage. And one member of the IC said that Israel got deeply compromised by that. And in the decades following, you have Netanyahu, who full-on campaigns with a giant billboard shaking hands with Putin, and that helps him stay in power. So do you think, obviously, like, Israel's, just like in the US, like, our problems are homegrown. Trump did not invent Jim Crow. Putin did not invent Jim Crow. Like, we have our own homegrown problems that Russia then exploits. We've got our gasoline, we've got our fires, and then Russia just pours more gasoline on it. The same dynamic in Israel. So Netanyahu and his whole far-right genocidal coalition, that's homegrown. But then Russia comes in and amplifies it, and they work together, they do their deals, they send their, Netanyahu green lights technology to go to Russia that can then slaughter Ukrainians. He sits on the sidelines as Ukraine's first Jewish president, the only Jewish head of state outside of Israel, is begging him for meaningful support. And even offering to come over and do, all sorts of appearances in Israel at the start of the war to try to build support among Israelis, and Netanyahu, really try to shut that down. And so how much do you think that Netanyahu himself is deeply infiltrated by all this? Like, do you think, because one of the first people after the Hamas attack that Netanyahu spoke to was Putin? How much do you think that Putin said to Netanyahu, let this happen?
To your second question, I personally don't think he said let this happen, because Russian intelligence operations are always compartmentalized, even to the point where the same team doesn't even have the full operation at play, because in the case someone gets captured, they don't want everyone having the full plot. So if they send 5 people to assassinate someone, using Novichok, they'll tell one person, here, you're carrying this, they don't know what it is, you're going to put it on the door handle. They tell someone else, this is what you're going to do in order to, in the case one of them do get captured, no one can fully reveal the whole plot. So I don't think so when it comes to a direct coordination. However, I do think Netanyahu has been so focused on overthrowing the Supreme Court, trying to erase his, corruption investigations against him, and to seize power permanently, frankly, because I think he doesn't have any intentions of leaving, that he was so consumed with those issues that he just overlooked any kind of intelligence, or just didn't want to be bothered with any intelligence that came to him indicating that something is happening. That's one. Now, going back to what you touched on in the Soviet Union, so we came through the Jackson-Vanik Amendment through Italy. I was born in Rome. On the way, my parents had a choice,
Brava,
from Rome.
Brava.
Brava. My parents had a choice, Israel or United States. Thank you, God, they picked United States. This is the best country in the world. But with that wave that we all traveled, everyone in the late 70s went the same exact way, criminals and good people like us, they went the same way, and this is how they went. A lot of people chose Israel, a lot of people chose America. Then you had a lot of swapping around where people from Israel decide to come to US and whatnot. Kalugin, again, who was head of counterintelligence, had said that not only did Russia, the Soviet Union, empty out their gulags and send a lot of the worst criminals here, and that's why you saw the natural thing that happened as soon as these Soviets arrived here was the formation of the Russian organized crime. So not only did they send the worst, but they also slipped in a lot of spies. And with that, they let them assimilate. And, say they arrived in the late 70s, they let them assimilate, learn the language, get the job, figure out how America works, this, that, and that. And then they would approach them. On Brighton Beach, here, right in our lovely New York, across the U.S., they would approach them and remind them, like, hey, you have loyalties to the motherland and you have to come work for us. Some people did. Kalugin said the success rate wasn't great. Some people said yes and, started reporting specifically on vulnerabilities inside of the United States. Where are the wedge issues? I mean, there was a whole host of factors that these people were useful. How the financial system works. Hence, you saw, the U.S. financial system turn into like the top mechanism for all the laundering of Russian money out of the Soviet Union and then out of Russia and whatnot later on. And then you had people who said no. And then obviously they didn't approach every single person because there was just a vast amount of people. But they did monitor them and, this one looks like he's an accountant and he's going to work for this firm. We might need information from, this field. Or this one is, just became a banker and he's going to work there. We want information from that field and whatnot. So your IC contact is very right, and it's extremely frustrating because at the same time we had the FBI here and they were completely oblivious to what was happening, specifically in the 80s. And they allowed they viewed Russian organized crime as the five families of New York, the Italian mafia families, viewing it as, all these operations as like incidents versus understanding that with the Russian organized crime, that they were an arm of Russian intelligence. And at that point, KGB, later on FSB and SVR, and that whatever they were doing here at the same time, they were collecting information back. So if they had a shady deal, like say with Trump, where, what's his name? David, oh my God, what is his name? It'll come to me. David, whatever, goes and hands Trump $5 million to buy 6 apartments in 1984. And Trump overlooks everything and says, oh, cash, a suitcase of cash, wonderful. They see this as a potential person who has no morals, moral compass, and that he will, for money, do anything. 2, they will report these dealings right back to the Russian security services. And that's how you saw the first infiltration. I mean, there were many different points because at the same time, Yakunin, who runs around, Europe with his NGOs and propping up the far right, in the 80s, late 80s, he was an KGB agent. His department specifically morphed into SVR later on, but he was a KGB agent in the Soviet mission to UN, specifically collecting and trying to steal American technology and recruit people who work anything with nuclear, with military, with anything with military tech. And then from there, you see he goes back to the Soviet Union, and you see quite a few of these. They're one of his colleagues who worked here in the library. She went back and opened up also a center in, in France, Democracy of Cooperation or something. Same thing. I mean, capturing politicians, capturing foreign policy makers, capturing former defense officials under the guise of an NGO. So, I mean, you see how these operations continue, and they obviously shift around and, sometimes they go dormant and whatever, but it's a continuation of one long Soviet operation to overthrow the United States and to destroy the United States and to end democracy globally.
And that is why the Russian assets, the Russian disinformation machines inside the Congress keep multiplying. It used to just be Dana Rohrabacher, a big old weirdo out of Orange County.
Yeah.
We were like Putin's groupie over there. Now it's an entire Kremlin caucus led by Matt Gaetz that just overthrew McCarthy and installed their Trump proxy to be third in line to the White House. It's a crisis point, and they're getting more and more successful because they take advantage of our liberties, obviously, and they take advantage of just they flood the zone with shit, both in terms of the disinformation across the media sphere, and that's all amplified by right-wing media, Fox News, all the way down. And then they flood the zone with shit when it comes to all of their corruption and money laundering that the DOJ and the FBI can't keep up with all of it. Like I've spoken with FBI and DOJ past and present, and they're just like, it's just constant. It's just constant.
Yeah.
This is what a federal prosecutor said. The more hits you take, the more hits you land. And that is the Russian and Bannon strategy. You flood the zone with shit. And I want to point out, like, there is a historical precedent here in terms of this new Cold War that we're in, democracy versus autocracy, and Ukraine being in a crucial front line of that, obviously. We were here before. The Cold War had hot wars, obviously. Korea, Vietnam, but also across Africa. There were several African nations that had like planes, bombers in the air. And it was a major hot war over decades in Africa. And if you go to Kiev, you meet veterans from South Africa and other countries, veterans of this war, who will tell you so many stories of fighting agents from Ukraine and Russia and elsewhere. Now they're living there, because they feel some sort of war bond with Ukrainians and so on. So We've been here before. We're here now. Where do you think so we have this monumental year in human history. We're a year away from the 2024 presidential election. Where do you see things going? Do you see this regional war in Israel and Hamas, these two genocidal forces with these civilians, poor civilians on both sides, caught in the middle of these genocidal forces, both aligned with Russia? It's an extraordinary crisis. Do you see that going into a regional war? How do you see it tipping the scales in the election?
I personally think that it has all the potential to skyrocket into a regional war. You have Iran, who's really, really pushing the strings. On the other hand, you have Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who are actually very, very worried. How much influence they have, I'm not sure, because this has been set off, But I don't know how much effect it will have on elections because, again, Americans are going to hear, oh, look, another war Americans are involved in. I think that the Biden policy is going to be to stand there to protect U.S. interest. People are spinning that Biden sent ships to support Israel and, whatever. Now, he sent ships because we have troops in Saudi Arabia and in Jordan and in Syria that are under attack in Iraq. Over the past week, you've had almost close to maybe even 3 dozen injuries among American military personnel from attacks that are being carried out by the Houthis in Yemen, by Iranian proxy groups in Syria and across. So of course he's going to send. So I'm not sure if it's really going to have an effect. I will say that Americans really need to wake up because this election is important. The next several elections are going to be extremely important until we get the extremists out of Congress and out of government. When we see that we don't have 17 Matt Gaetzes and Marjorie Taylor Greens running around and shutting down Congress for 3 weeks, when we get to a point of that, then you can kind of take a breather and say, okay, I think we've saved democracy. And it is extremely troubling seeing the split among the Democrats because for them to say, I'm not going to vote for Biden means that they will either vote for Trump or give the vote to Trump. And that means Trump has very clearly not only came out and said he supports Hezbollah, but he also said he's going to nuke Palestine and just make sure in one clean sweep that all Palestinians are erased. So I think, you have one extremely fringe lunatic who is telling us, we don't even have to guess what he's going to do. He is telling us, I'm going to weaponize Department of Justice. I'm going to arrest all my opponents. I'm going to arrest every prosecutor who has looked into me, every prosecutor who has filed charges against me. I'm going to strip the FBI and basically, shut down the FBI and this and that. And then on the global stage, I am going to let Ukraine be handed to Russia, which is not going to satisfy Russia's appetite because then next is going to be Moldova, Estonia, Lithuania, and guess what? American boots will be on the ground. Right now, Ukrainians are shedding their blood to make sure Europe is secure. And if Ukraine falls, American boots will be on the ground. This is the whole point of NATO. And Trump thinks and is again screeching that he's going to take U.S. out of NATO. Guess what? It's not very simple to do that. And in Congress, he won't be able to maneuver it. So in the worst case, you're going to have one of the most important NATO members working to sabotage all NATO operations and to keep Europe secure. And then he's going to obviously you saw his policy, why should we even have Palestinians, just nuke them all? So, frankly, you don't want to vote for Biden, this is what you're going to get. And not to mention that Trump already said that on day one, he's putting his Muslim ban and banning any Muslim coming into this country. So, if this is the alternative you want, knock yourself out. I'm moving to Ukraine. I just came back from Ukraine.
Olga, you have the bedroom here downstairs. You can come here downstairs.
No, I came
Come on,
back from
baby.
Ukraine, and it was so good, and Kiev is so pretty, and I'm like, what if this insanity continues, in U.S. and we don't correct our wrongs and get on the right path?
Can I just say that from the European point of view, even thinking, of putting Trump back in, for us, it would be the end of NATO, because let's remember that it was the Biden administration that had managed through a lot of talking with allied partners and strengthening those ties to make sure that NATO was on board and that they would wake up, because they were all slumbering. All right, the same with the EU. Let's remember that Scholz told, Zelensky, oh, well, why don't you just give up? You're going to lose anyway. Let's remember that, because
the Chancellor of Germany.
That's really the Chancellor of Germany, the strongest economic power in Europe, told Zelensky to fold. Now he has changed, at least on the surface. They're giving lots of weapons, and lots of aid. But, what is it? These got the business community, the industrialists who are down his neck, probably calling him every day saying, Schulze, no, wie geht's? All right, that's what he's saying. All right, that's what's going on. So it's really important. I can't interfere. I can't tell you guys how to vote. But from the European point of view, it was thanks to the Biden administration that we finally saw the EU stand up morally, right? Let's remember the horrible stand that they took, right, when Crimea was occupied by the Russians, where Merkel and Hollande, are just saying, or whoever it was, Sarkozy or whoever it was at that time, just said, on the left, Françoise is telling them, oh, come on, come to the table, so on and so. We need that nice Russian gas. This is what we're talking about. At least now there is some discussion on a moral standpoint, seeing that this is what the Russians are really like, and this is what can happen to you. Look at Crimea. Look what's going on with their population inside. Kids having to do camps, Russian camps. These are war crimes, and Olga knows it better than I do because you've been talking to people in Ukraine for months.
It's been happening since 2014.
Exactly.
How everyone was shoving Russian money through their wallets and ignoring the fact of what was happening.
Look, I just came back from the Crimea platform, the forum itself. And it's so important that we keep in mind the focus, the real things that we need to focus on. That's what I wanted to say. And it's extremely important. First, European security, this kind of thing.
And my last comment, look, Biden has been good with Ukraine. And I do agree, and I sympathize with, the Middle Eastern community because he has been good with Ukraine. I think more so for the fact that it is a European country, and if we have a European war, World War III, break out, because we did look the other way across Europe, it would be, a bad policy. But with everything, I'm not going to be fake. Biden's Middle Eastern policy has been abysmal. He has completely forgot that Syrians exist. He has provided no support for Syrians and whatnot. I have a lot of criticism for their Middle Eastern policy over the past 4 years. But with that said,
would millions of people in Gaza right now.
Yeah. And I agree. But with that said, I will still vote for Biden, because if I do not vote for Biden, then I will have a Trump who will probably have people like me arrested or forced to leave the United States to silence us, because he's not going to allow any criticism the second time around. And his policies would be so devastating to every cause. To Ukrainian cause, to the Middle Eastern cause, to everyone. It would be devastating, because this is an outright conman, fascist, racist, populist thug who only wants to, see how much he can steal from America and arrest anyone who gets in his way, which is basically a carbon copy of Putin. So that's
and
why
Netanyahu.
I feel, regardless of at least with the Biden administration, you can go and say, you know what, your policies are abysmal, and you can continue to put pressure, and no one is going to come in to rescue for putting that pressure. Try that with the Trump administration, with Trump 2.0, God forbid. I mean, it's not even an administration, Trump regime. You're going to tell them your policies are abysmal, and they'll come and have you arrested on some trumped up charges. So that's why I think people really need to get their thing together. And you know what? Instead of fueling this anger and all these campaigns, I'm not voting for Biden. Go and organize and force to sit down to speak with Biden officials, with the NSC, and with State Department officials to say, you know what, we support you, but not this, and we want you to do this. We don't want you to overlook the carpet bombing of neighborhoods inside of Gaza. We want the United States to have this position across the whole globe, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Gaza, wherever it is. If you're carpet bombing indiscriminately buildings where you know there are women and children, then you say no. And that's it. And you have one solid position across everywhere. Or just, shut up and don't push values. And no, he's not too old.
Oh, thank you.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
To help people in Maui rebuild after the fires, donate to the Maui Strong Fund at hawaiicommunityfoundation.org. That's hawaiicommunityfoundation.org. Since Matt Gaetz and the rest of the Kremlin caucus want to hurt Ukraine, Ukraine needs all the help it can get as Russia's genocide continues. Donate to Razum for Ukraine at razumforukraine.org. We encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. Our production manager is Nicholas Torres, and our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon-exclusive content is produced by Carlin Daigle. Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Barr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher: Withrow C. Newell, Chick Quinn, Lily Wachowski, Sean Rubin, Todd S. Perlstein, Kenny Main, Ellen McGirt, Joel Ferron, Karen A. Deal, Larry Gasson, Brian E. Castor, David Collier, Tatjana Birch, Karen Heisler, Ann Bertino, John Millett, David East, Ida, Joseph Mara Jr., Julie Matthews, Mark, Barbara Kittredge, Matthew Womack, Sean Berg, Kristen Custer, William Barry Reeves, Emmy, Kevin Gannon, Mike Christensen, Sandra Collins, Katie Masuris, Emily Fenning, James D. Leonard, Leo Chalupa, Carol Golstad, Jason Benke, Marcus J. Trent, Joe Darcy, Ann Marshall, Jeremy Lewis, Trigve, D.L. Singfield, Nicole Spear, Abby Road, Margaret Romero, Z.W., Sarah Gray, Diana Gallagher, John Ripley, Leah Campbell, Jared Lombardo, Ann Marshall, and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you all for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.